So Torquemada explained that the reason why Alan had been de-aged so significantly, it had to do with the Starheart. Something had happened, and the Starheart had left the outer reaches of the universe. So clearly, that part of the Starheart, which had become Alan's power battery all those years ago, saw the need to become active and de-age Alan to the point where he would be young and vital enough to join Torquemada in space in confronting the larger Starheart. And so before leaving, Alan donned not his classic Green Lantern costume, rather, he morphed an entirely new Green Lantern costume around his body. Up until this point, the majority of stories showed Alan physically changing his clothes or taking off his Green Lantern uniform, getting into his civilian gear. At most, what I saw was one Bronze Age story where Alan was able to use his ring to do a quick switch to transfer his Green Lantern costume back to his closet and then quickly don his civilian gear. But here, Alan was doing what members of a GLC would do and just instantly transformed their clothes into their costume. And what a costume it was. It was now only red and green. The yellow and purple were gone. The shirt and pants look was gone. The transition from the red top to green bottom was similar to Hal Jordan's current costume design, the way that the green on top ends in a point and then becomes black. Well, just imagine that happening with Alan, except going red to green. He now had these high green boots. He had these long green gloves, meaning that he was wearing a Green Lantern ring over a green glove. The cape was all green. The high collar was still there. It got even higher. In fact, the front ends of the cape were now pointed tips. Depending on who the artist was during this period, Alan's mask was green, but the edges also ended in pointed tips. And Alan's classic Green Lantern logo was replaced by a larger logo that looked more like a standard Green Lantern Corps logo. Before I go on with the story, I should talk about my issues with the costume. Well, I should also add that the Starheart also appeared to make Alan's hair grow longer. He didn't have a mullet. His hair certainly wasn't as long as Superman's was after Superman returned from the dead, but it was longer than usual. I'm kind of thinking, why would Alan, who wasn't de-aged mentally or emotionally by a Starheart, why he would go for this look? I mean, the green high boot seemed like a bit much. So did the gloves going so high up his arms. The fact that Alan wore gloves, I had an issue with, because going back to those Golden Age stories, Alan very often got his way out of a skirmish by using his fists. He was a skilled bare-knuckle brawler, and as a former engineer, as someone who worked with his hands, I couldn't see Alan being the type to want to wear gloves. Gloves work great for members of the Green Lantern Corps. The white gloves work because they show that members of the Corps aren't just cops, they're also diplomats. They're also agents of peace. And the white works so well because the Green Lantern rings show up against the white gloves so well. Just thinking of, this has happened with other Lanterns like Kyle Rayner when Jim Lee redesigned his costume, and Kyle would wear his Green Lantern ring over a green glove. That makes no sense. Unless you've got a really skilled colorist who's going to use two distinct shades of green, it doesn't really make sense. the high collar being even higher seemed outlandish depending on who was drawing it. The pointed tips at the front made it look like Alan had somehow managed to twist the cape and put the collar on backwards. And then when some artist showed his mask ending with pointed tips, it looked rather sinister. It looked like the type of mask that Hal Jordan wore when he became Parallax. The green mask made sense enough, but really just having the red and the green, it made Alan look like something of a Christmas lantern, and thank goodness nobody made a crack like that in front of Alan, but it certainly made one miss the purple and yellow elements. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be too many years before we'd see the classic costume come back. But that was a costume that Alan would wear for the remainder of this issue. He would go with Torquemada into space, where they would confront the Starheart that had become completely malevolent at this point. It had taken on a humanoid form, which Alan proceeded to rip limb from limb, but because the Starheart was magic and it wasn't really a humanoid entity, it escaped, with Alan swearing that he would use his power to make sure that the Starheart never threatened his family, ever. This story set an important precedent, not just in terms of how Alan was transformed physically, but in terms of the concept of the Starheart being a malevolent entity. Certainly that part of the Starheart, which was Alan's power battery, was entirely benevolent, but this was the first time that we saw that the Starheart was malevolent. In fact, the Starheart explained that, yes, a young woman named Mala, who, by the way, had been introduced in the Starheart origin story way back in the Bronze Age, the Starheart revealed that it killed Mala because Mala was the Starheart's keeper, keeping the Starheart in place. And so the Starheart had killed her, and now it wanted more. And this concept of a malevolent Starheart was a concept which would be revisited in future stories over the coming years, as most recently as, I want to say, 2010 by James Robinson. So this was the look that Alan Scott would keep for the remainder of the Copper Age. There was no plan, it seemed, to age Alan back to his proper chronological age, or something that was closer to his true chronological age. By this point, in the 90s, Alan should have been a man somewhere in his 70s. On his worst day, he looked like he was in his early 50s. But certainly the ramifications of his transformation into a 20-something-year-old would be explored in future stories past Zero Hour in the second half of the 90s. For now, I can tell you that Alan would pop up, not just in Green Lantern Corps titles, but as well as other books. He made a brief appearance in the Reign of the Superman story arc, where he was part of a team which included his daughter Jade, where they were going to Coast City in response to Mongol and Cyborg Superman's destruction of the city. And Alan would also play a pretty important part in the 1994 event Zero Hour. Zero Hour was an event that was meant to serve as a soft reboot for the DCU. What writer-artist Dan Jurgens had come to be aware of all too well during his time as one of the main Superman writers and pencilers was that within only 10 years of the publication of Crisis on Infinite Earths, there were a number of continuity issues that had arisen, in part due to the fact that the multiverse had been condensed into one single universe. But there were a lot of continuity issues, a lot of inconsistencies, contradictions between different titles, thanks to the fact that Crisis wasn't really a reboot. It was a relaunch that consisted of a set of staggered reboots. And because all of those reboots happened at different times, it led to line-wide inconsistencies. And so Zero Hour was meant to address that, to explain, sweep away those plot inconsistencies, resulting in the creation of a single post-crisis DC universe that had a much more consistent continuity. And so I'll be talking a whole lot more about that in part 3 of my spotlight on Green Lantern Alan Scott in the Copper Age. Amazing, for only an 8-year period in which he was absent for half of the time. This is actually going to a third part. But part 3 I don't think is going to be so long, folks. I am going to spend some time, though, talking about what transpired during Zero Hour, with my focus, of course, being on Alan Scott's involvement in the event. And then that's where I'll cap things until another Spotlight episode on Alan Scott, where I'll look at what happened to Alan during the second half of the 1990s. So at this point, my plan is to come back to you next week with part 3 for a shorter release. So that gives you some time to brush up on Zero Hour if you want to crack open your issues of that 5-parter or the trade. It is, of course, the story that got me back into the game of reading comics on a consistent basis. So until another 7 days have come and gone, this class is once again in recess.